Today, we're going to explore the lifetimes and campaigns of Lance Daffadar Abdul Hakim Khan, an Indian cavalryman who fought in World War II during the Siege of Tobruk against the might of the German Afrika Corps and was awarded a mention in dispatches. Although the Australian 9th Division claims credit for defending Tobruk against the Germans, and quite rightly, a little known fact was that an Indian regiment fought side by side with the Aussies. Abdul Khan belonged to this regiment, which was the 18th King Edward's Own Cavalry Regiment, and with the Australians, Khan and his regiment earned the hard-fought honour of being one of the Rats of Tobruk. The regiment was formed in 1921 by the amalgamation of the King Edward's Own 6th Cavalry and the 7th Haryana Lancers. Going forward, I'm just going to refer to the regiment as the 18th Cav, as it's a bit of a mouthful otherwise. The ethnic composition of the regiment after the amalgamation in 1921 consisted of a squadron each of Kamkanis, Rajputana Rajputs and Jats. Sadly, we don't have much information on Abdul Khan's background, however, we can make an educated guess. On his medal set, he has a Pakistan medal, which was a commemorative medal recognising the service of soldiers just before and after the creation of Pakistan in August 1947. This likely meant Khan elected to serve in the Pakistani army after partition. Therefore, it's probable that Abdul Khan came from the Kamkani ethnic group, who were a Muslim community originally from Rajasthan. They were notable for ruling the Fatehpur and Junjonu regions of Rajasthan from the 1300s to the 1700s and claimed to be descended from Chauhan Rajputs, who converted from Hinduism to Islam in the 14th century. Apologies for any mispronunciations there. This would make sense, as one of the historical recruiting grounds for the regiment seemed to be in the Gwalior region just to the east of Rajasthan. Most of the Kamkanis migrated to the southern part of Sindh in Pakistan after partition, which may have included Abdul Khan. During the 1930s, the regiment took part in operations in the northwest frontier province, most notably against the Mohmand Pathans north of the Khyber Pass. This was due to raids and attacks on road construction parties. As Abdul Khan was Lance Daffadar, the equivalent rank to a corporal in 1941, it is likely he may have served as a private during this earlier period and garnered some combat experience. A year after the outbreak of World War II, in 1940, 18th Cav became the second to last cavalry regiment to be mechanised in India, leaving only the Pune horse still mounted on horses, although that would soon be mechanised a month later. The 18th Cav then became part of the 3rd Indian Motor Brigade. Originally part of the 1st Indian Armoured Division, the 3rd Indian Motor Brigade, including the 18th Cav, was detached from the division and sent to Egypt in late January 1941, arriving at Suez on the 6th of February. The regiment was tactically mobile but had no artillery, no 2-pounder anti-tank guns, only half the radios were required, and was armed mainly with rifles. Not great, is it? The brigade was given 2 months desert training in Mersa Matruh and Al Adem during March and April 1941 and then deployed immediately to the front. The brigade saw its first action when surrounded by Axis forces during the German offensive known as Operation Sunflower. Frustratingly for the 18th Cav, however, most of them were left behind guarding an airfield. During this battle, Axis forces under Lieutenant General Erwin Rommel, also known as the Desert Fox, aimed to recapture Machili from the British and then continue east, surrounding British forces. Elements of the 18th Cav did finally join the brigade during the later battle, skirmishing with Axis forces and bravely leading a breakout attempt when British forces were surrounded. The breakout was described thus: the 24 vehicles of the 18th Cavalry passed the Axis gun line, turned and charged. At the enemy guns, the squadron divided. Each troop went round a flank and the infantry made a bayonet attack, scattering the crews of the 12 enemy guns and supporting infantry. The Indians then remounted and drove off, having suffered 17 casualties, including at least 2 men killed. This brave action contributed to allowing the British to escape the encirclement. However, Rommel's swift and aggressive tactics overall allowed Axis forces to retake Machili, forcing the British to retreat further east. On a positive note, the defence of Machili delayed the Axis advance, giving time for the 9th Australian Division to retreat to Tobruk and prepare its defences. Tobruk was a crucial supply port for both British and Axis forces, and possession of this port would decide the course of the war in North Africa. The garrison commander of Tobruk was the resolute Major General Leslie J. Morshead, leader of the Australian Division and a disciplinarian who is known to his troops as Ming the Merciless, after the villain in the Flash Gordon comic strips and serials. He was tenacious as Rommel. "There'll be no Dunkirk here," he said to his staff. "If we should have to get out, we'll fight our way out, and there'll be no surrender and no retreat." As Axis forces surrounded Tobruk, the siege began and lasted from April the 10th until November the 27th, 1941, with Allied forces, primarily the 9th Australian Division, besieged constantly. There were approximately 14,000 Australian troops and 12,000 British and some Indian troops in Tobruk during the siege. The Royal Navy still controlled the waters around the port, so they were able to supply provisions to the men holding Tobruk. The 18th Cavalry were attached to the 9th Australian Division as a divisional cavalry unit consisting of A Squadron, Jats, B Squadron, Jaipuri Muslims, I assume the Konkanis, and C Squadron, the Rajputs. There was also a headquarters squadron. Throughout the siege, the defenders, including the Indian troops, faced harsh desert conditions, constant artillery bombardment and air raids. Despite these challenges, they maintained their positions and repelled several Axis attacks. During the siege, the 18th Cav was initially held in reserve, and then on the 19th of April, they were ordered to occupy a 5-kilometre section of the perimeter, from north of the Derna Road to the sea. 3 days later, A Squadron went 3 miles west to cover a raid by the Australians, who captured 730 Italian prisoners. These raids, sapping enemy strength and interfering with their supply line, especially angered the Germans. Nazi propaganda started referring to the defenders of Tobruk as the Rats of Tobruk. These defenders would forever be immortalised as the legendary Rats of Tobruk. Despite supplies coming in by ship from the Royal Navy, the conditions within Tobruk were still hellish for a lot of soldiers. A Royal Artillery sergeant who was serving in the garrison commented, "The desert fleas are famous, and ours were obviously in the pay of the enemy. How we cursed them on nights when the moon was late up, and we hoped to catch a couple of hours' sleep before the inevitable procession of night bombers started. The fleas marched up and down our twitching bodies until we thought we would go crazy." Receiving 78 reinforcements during the siege, the 18th Cav was finally relieved on the 26th of August. They sailed to Alexandria in 3 destroyers under constant attack by Axis bombers. The siege would last until the end of November, a total of 7.5 months. 18th Cav had endured over 4 of those months. Their resistance, along with the rest of the garrison, prevented the Axis from using Tobruk's port, which was crucial for supply lines. Casualties for the Indian contingent during the siege were 1 killed and 25 wounded. The 18th Cav, being naturally aggressive cavalrymen, I would imagine would have been quite frustrated at being held up in defensive pillboxes, just awaiting constant enemy attacks. Their forte was reconnaissance and desert patrols. Although Rommel and his Afrika Corps were forced to retreat from Tobruk and lick their wounds and build up their strength for a few months, they would be back on the offensive. It was during this time that Abdul Khan earned his mention in dispatches. Sadly, we know little of Abdul Khan's actual specific action for earning his mention in dispatches, other than it occurred between July and October of 1941, during which period his regiment was defending Tobruk. Some information on the MID, or Mention in Dispatches, award. Servicemen and women of the United Kingdom or the Commonwealth who are mentioned in dispatches are not awarded a medal for their actions, but receive a certificate and wear an oak leaf device on the ribbon of the appropriate campaign medal. The oak leaf of an initial award was bronze until 1993, and the giving of an award was traditionally published in the London Gazette. Abdul Khan would have also received a message from a representative of the King to acknowledge his own gallantry and his own distinguished service for his MID. After the siege of Tobruk, there was a brief lull and respite for Abdul Khan and the 18th Cav. However, with Rommel's offensive coming in spring 1942, when the desert rains cleared, the next major action the unit was involved in was the Battle of Gazala in May and June 1942. After holding off a major tank assault by the Italian Ariete Division for about an hour, the Indians were overrun by the sheer weight of numbers. This localised tank battle lasted 3 days as the Italians and Germans tried to break the British line. Although heavily outnumbered and finally overrun, the Indians managed to destroy or damage 23 tanks and inflict about 80 casualties. The action came at a heavy price for the Indians though, who lost 440 men killed and wounded and about 1,000 prisoners. However, it doesn't appear that Abdul Khan was one of those POWs, as many of the other Indians managed to escape along with other British forces further east. The wider Gazala battle lasted nearly 4 weeks and was a major defeat for the British, who in total lost around 50,000 men as casualties or wounded, and over 1,000 tanks or armoured vehicles destroyed. Tobruk was then finally captured by Axis forces. I wonder what the emotions were from the survivors from 18th Cav, who spent all those months defending it back in 1941 to then see it lost again. Churchill wrote of the Battle of Gazala, "It was one of the heaviest blows I can recall during the war. Not only were its military efforts grievous, but it had affected the reputation of the British armies." The Indian Brigade was devastated during this battle and was ordered to hand over the surviving 50% of its vehicles and briefly deployed back to guard duties in Egypt. Tobruk would remain in German hands until it was retaken during General Bernard Montgomery's advance after the Great Second Battle of El Alamein in October to November 1942, one of the major turning points of the war. In August 1942, the brigade was reformed and along with 18th Cav, travelled overland to Persia and then in January 1943 returned to India. Field Marshal Sir Archibald Waverley, who was the Commander-in-Chief of India at the time, welcomed back the 18th Cav with a specific message. "I am glad to welcome you back to India after an absence of 2 years, during which period you have advanced the reputation of both your own regiment and the Indian Army." In 1944, the regiment was finally commanded by an Indian commandant, Lieutenant Colonel Hiralal Atal, who went on to become a Major General and later designed the Indian equivalent of the Victoria Cross Gallantry Award. The regiment was then split up, with units of the regiment serving in different parts of India until the end of the war. It seems as Abdul Khan didn't receive a Burma Star or any other awards, he remained within India during this time. Over the course of the Second World War, the 18th King Edward's Own Cavalry won numerous gallantry awards, including up to 7 mentioned in dispatches, one of which was awarded to Abdul Khan. When India was partitioned in 1947 and the Indian Army split between the new created states of India and Pakistan, the 18th Cav was allocated to India. The Kemkani Squadron was given the option to stay in India or transfer to Pakistan. Most transferred to Pakistan. An officer of the 18th Cav that transferred, Yaqub Khan, later would become a Pakistani foreign minister under General Zia. When India became a republic in 1950, the regiment's title was changed to that of 18th Cavalry. It is now proudly part of the Rota, or Rats of Tobruk Association,